DukeBox, the voice of the Wellington family.
Live on DukeBox Radio, the Jack Chong Show.
Hello everybody, welcome back to Jack Chong Wednesday Live, and today we're very, very glad to have 4 members of staff of Wellington College to join us today to have a discussion on Does God Exist? Can we have a brief introduction of yourselves, please, starting with Mr. Allcock?
Hello, I'm Mr. Allcock. I'm the head of classics here.
Hello, I'm Dr. Williams. I'm the head of sixth form here.
Hello, I'm Richard Atherton. I run the IB.
And I'm Dr. Tapley, and I teach philosophy and religion and talk.
Sure, thank you so much for coming, and thank you for your time. Now, today's rundown is going to be, there will be 3 sections. The first section will be focusing on the existence of God. The second section will be focusing on a post-God world. The third section will be to seek common ground, as today's show is called. So why don't we start off by answering the first question. Can we ever know that God exists?
I'll start, shall I? My own view is that it's not possible to know whether God exists. I think it's not possible because there are no compelling reasons that I've seen to suggest that he does. I think there are no compelling reasons that I've seen to suggest that he doesn't. And a couple of other things too. I think that human intellect has a limited capacity to understand the universe that we live in, and if there is a God, our possibility for understanding something as big as God would be challenged. And I also think if there were to be a God, God would have very good reasons for us to not be certain that he existed, so that our own freedom wouldn't be inhibited, and so there'd be a genuine choice whether to respond to God or not. So for those reasons, I really think we probably can't know that God exists, or at least I feel I don't know whether he exists.
I think a theist can know God exists, but an atheist can't know that he doesn't. So I think a theist can, literally see God, and I think that's enough to say that they know God exists. Obviously, I don't agree with them. I think they might be deluded, but from their point of view, I think it's acceptable to say I know God exists. I think that's fair.
Okay, if I can come in after that, can we know if God exists in a physical sense? I think if there is evidence available to the empirical senses, we would have found it by now. Though, like any good scientist, I wouldn't want to rule out future evidence coming up that we haven't considered. So physically, I think no. Supernaturally, I think it's much more difficult, per Dr. Williams' response, to answer either way. So we're committed to either a matter of opinion or a leap of faith, or an agnostic central position. But if we ask the question, does God exist from the point of view of what I call an exigent moral value, that is, a value which people feel in their lives, then clearly he does exist, or she does exist. We only have to look at the Christian communities and those of faith to see that patently God does exist for those people. So whilst, for me personally, God does not exist, I clearly see that God does exist for over 3 billion people in the world.
I think I'd want to pick up on that idea and say, just because people choose to believe something, whether it's 3 million or fewer, that doesn't mean it's true. I'm a Christian, and I think God is out there because he is a real being out there, not because lots of us believe it. That is an existence. I think existence needs to be a real objective reality. But where I'd agree with these guys is that God is, the theist God, or the Christian God particularly, is outside the universe. And the sort of proofs that either our rational mind, as people have said, or science can look for and test are in the universe by nature. We're in the universe. We're physical beings. And the tests we can do are in here. And so almost by definition, you couldn't test God in that sense of knowing him. But I'll happily say more later on about why I think you can know him.
Yeah, because what you just said sounds to me that you assume one of the traits of God is not to be testable, and then you say, well, we can't test. So and so it doesn't mean he doesn't exist. It sounds like a circular argument to me.
Well, specifically, I'm saying he can't be testable in a scientific sense.
Okay.
Because science can test what is within the universe, and God is outside. If God created the universe, which would be a Christian belief, he's outside it and over it. So I'm saying one type of test, the idea of a scientific test, isn't realistic.
I agree with that. I do agree with that. Although I slightly disagree with Simon and slightly agree more with James about what it might mean for God to exist in the absence of proof and with the absence of a commitment to him existing objectively. I think there's a sort of bit of a disagreement, I guess, over what it means to exist in a meaningful way. And one of the things that's interesting about the debate about God is sometimes people are talking about apples and oranges, and if you have a particular notion of God or a particular notion of what it means to exist, you might end up arriving at different conclusions on the basis of that. And I think if Simon is saying that significant existence is for God to exist objectively and independently of people's minds and of the world, then to me it's absolutely clear we cannot know certainly that being exists. I would have some sympathy with what James was saying, actually. Well, you can say it's possible to exist in a meaningful way other than objectively and independently, and all kinds of kind of cultural phenomena, historical phenomena, etc. do, and those things are important, perhaps significant enough to be the basis of religion. I don't know.
So, how would you summarize your position on this issue? So, because for those of the listeners who are not very well aware of those technical terms, those isms and key terms are summarized. For example, what does it mean to be a skeptic? What does it mean to be agnostics? Do you mind just clarifying some of the beliefs that you have?
Okay, well, I'll start that one. My intellectual background is in philosophy, and specifically Sartrean existential philosophy, which is atheistic in outlook. Having said that, and I do nail my colours to the atheist mast, I have no evidence that I can give you which would prove that God does not exist. So technically I'm an agnostic, but I declare myself to be atheist.
Yes, I think it's worth looking at the words. Agnostic means without knowledge, the prefix a, without knowledge. I don't know whether God exists or not, or which gods exist or not. So I'm definitely an agnostic. However, I'm also an atheist in that I live my life as though there isn't a God. I wouldn't know which God to pick if I were to live my life in a theistic way. And so I live my life without God, so I'm an atheist. But I'm also an anti-theist in that I think I kind of just hope that God doesn't exist, because I think it's a much more interesting world where it's up to us humans to try and work everything out for ourselves if God doesn't exist.
I would use the word agnostic to describe me, although it seems Rich and I have very different views, funnily enough, even though we have the same label. I think I'm probably closer to James, but I choose the same label as Richard. I would describe myself as agnostic because I believe the proposition God exists cannot be known to be true, and it cannot be known to be false. And I think it is not only that I lack that knowledge, I think it's fairly unlikely there would be a way to answer that question as well. As for our response to that, however, as far as I'm concerned, I think it is a reasonable thing to do to live your life as though there is a God. It's something that I choose to do, and I don't have an atheist faith, or I'm not an atheist Christian. I'm an agnostic one, and I live my life as though there is a God and happily respond and take part in a chapel service as a true believer.
So you would live your life as if you were a Christian?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and I would have no problem with doing that. I'm sure other people find that really puzzling. I think it is perhaps, if I'm totally honest, because it's one of my character traits. I find it very difficult to commit to things. I love sitting on the fence, and intellectually I find it difficult to not sit on the fence. Okay. But I also have great love and memory of a Christian upbringing. It's a very happy upbringing, and I see no reason to change that.
Sure. That was one soundbite over there. You have problems with commitment. Your wife's going to listen to this.
Intellectual commitments, Jack. Intellectual commitments. Emotional ones I'm really good at.
Of course. Mr. Allcock.
I guess I complete the lineup. I could have the technical label a theist, and that just means I believe in a God. But I wouldn't use that of myself specifically. I would call myself a Christian. I believe in the Christian God, and we were talking about the problem of knowing God if he's outside the universe. And the Christian belief, my one, would be we can only know God in as far as he reveals himself into the universe, that we can't see out of it. And the Christian belief would be that the Bible is the sufficient way of knowing God, that he tells us what we need to know about him. So I would believe in what God shows about himself in the Bible.
That was a really good mini summary and a sort of like a declaration of your beliefs or disbeliefs. That was very good. So can we move on to go through a few arguments for the existence of God? For you, Mr. Allcock, sorry for you to speak again, but you seem to be in a quite lonely position in today's panel. Can you go through maybe the most important, the most convincing argument that you think God exists?
Very happy to. Although I might say at the beginning, we all have a faith position here in a sense. So I don't think it's up to me just to defend mine and the others are defaults. We all have a faith position. But I think three main areas for me have persuaded me that I can know and it's reasonable to know. The first would be a big broad one for the existence of a God, that I look at creation, the universe, beauty, morality, these sort of big picture things. And I think that the idea of a rational being behind it all, both as a first cause, where does it come from? It doesn't seem to me to make sense to come from nothing. But also, why do we have morality? What's the basis for morality? These sort of big questions point me towards a rational being behind it all. That doesn't point me to the Christian God specifically, but to God in general. And then narrowing down on that, the Christian faith is a historical faith. And as a Christian, it's through seeing Jesus that I think we get a glimpse of God. That as a Christian, I believe Jesus was God come to earth so that we could see him in a way that we can't when God is outside the world. And as we look at him, this person who is a real historical person, I think the accounts are credible as an account of someone who's more than just a man, that we're seeing God on earth. We could talk about this more in a minute, but particularly the resurrection, that if this person came back from the dead, this is something that people can't do. This is someone who is not just a man, and we get a glimpse of God here. So for me, the credibility and my belief in Jesus is how I know what God is like and that he is there. And then finally, experience, that having made an intellectual commitment to this, I decided this was going to be what I build my life around. And you taste it and you see, and for me, I've tasted it and it's made sense of life and it's been good. And that's not something I can quantify or prove, but for me, I've made the decision on the basis of the arguments, but then I've tasted it and it's worked.
Sure, so that was your personal engagement with the faith that you have. Before the atheist and the skeptics respond to Mr. Allcock's question, I just want to point perhaps the direction of the discussion to whether to ask if these arguments really matter, because and what I'm getting at is for skeptics or for atheists or for agnostics, they would say it is, we simply cannot decide determinately whether God exists. So the conclusions drawn from any arguments at all, they are like the efforts to arrive at a conclusive step is futile. And what do you think of that?
I would disagree with that. Oh, sorry. Do you want to go?
Well, I'm not sure whether I'm
Mr.
answering your
James,
question,
and
Jeff,
You don't have to be
or
that polite.
your
Yeah,
question.
I'll go next. Go on,
Okay.
James.
Just to come back to Simon, actually, he presented 3 sets of arguments. If I could respond to them in reverse order. The final argument you gave was in terms of personal experience, and from my perspective, that's the most powerful of the things you said, and that's the one I find most difficult to argue back against. Your experience of Christianity is very real for you, and that for me is all I need to know, and I'm not even going to attempt to dispute that. And I would say that not just to you, Simon, but to any Christian or any Muslim or any other person of faith. So that's the most powerful one for me. That doesn't necessarily mean I conclude that God exists in a physical, supernatural or objective sense, but he exists in a sense which matters. And that's that. The second set of arguments that you referred to was the Jesus and the resurrection. My own personal response to that would be, I think that the Gospels, the teachings of Jesus, are admirable and worth following regardless of whether you think he was the Son of God. I don't think Jesus was the Son of God, but I do think that his teachings are valuable to us all and worthwhile. So not sufficient to prove the existence of God, but definitely something to a good guideline in life. And the first set of arguments that you referenced regarded the creation, beauty and morality. My own personal view on that is these things can be explained without reference to God. That's obviously a huge conversation which we can have now or another day, but I would point to science for creation. I would point to many things for beauty, but not necessarily God amongst them. And morality, I would not say is human made, because I think we see it in animals, but I think it's you can organic creatures can come up with morality without reference to a God. So that's my own personal response, but I found the third of your arguments to be the most powerful because that's what matters most to me.
Now, kind of stitching that together and coming back to you, Jack, I think I would take issue slightly with what you were sort of suggesting about, well, if these arguments don't have compelling force, are they really worthwhile? Perhaps we should just ditch them, ignore them. Actually, I would disagree with that. I don't think for an argument to have value, it necessarily has to be compelling, because arguments can shape our thoughts in all kinds of interesting and unanticipated ways. We can learn from them, even when they don't necessarily compel us to change our beliefs. And actually, in the case of religion, I think because religion is such a rich cultural phenomenon, and it is so difficult to understand why we believe the things we do about religion. I think seeing those arguments as insights into a way of seeing the world and a way in which a religious appreciation of the world, what that might be like, I think entering into those with a kind of sense of empathy and interest can really expand the way you think about things, and you can really learn from that. So I've never been compelled by the arguments for the existence of God, but I've always been intrigued by them, and I've always learned from them, and I'll continue to take an interest in them. I think that sort of relates a little bit to what James was saying as well in certain respects. Yeah.
The one thing I would say is that I disagree with Simon's arguments, but I think he's right in saying that atheist is essentially a sort of faith position. And so just if I manage to shoot down your arguments, I don't think that shows anything, because I don't think it's possible for anyone to construct an argument on either side. However, to shoot down the third part of your argument, I would say is we could get somebody else in here, a Muslim, who will say exactly the same thing. And I personally, as an atheist, really love my position in life. It doesn't prove anything. Yeah. So I don't think it is valid in terms of a proof of God.
It was merely meant as an argument that having made a decision on what I think makes sense, it's worrying to make a decision and then find it doesn't work or doesn't. It contradicts how you find life in practice. That it's not the making of the decision, but the world should work in line with what you say is true. And my experience has been it does. It doesn't make the decision. Agreed.
Yeah.
Okay, that is actually deeply philosophical, and I was very close to getting lost. So that was that we would call it the conclusion, the mini summary of the first session we had. about the existence of God. Can we just have a reiteration of your positions, starting from Dr. Tapley?
Well, my own position, I've even written it down so I didn't forget.
So label yourselves.
I label myself as an atheist, although I have no proof to distinguish myself from the agnostics. God does not exist for me personally, and I find the arguments, many of which we haven't touched upon here today, but there are many others out there, I find them unconvincing. Nevertheless, God does exist for over 2 billion Christians, over 1 billion Muslims, and I am not going to dispute their personal experience of it.
Well, I'm an agnostic. I simply don't know. Richard Dawkins has a scale, I think it's from 1 to 7 for some reason. It's a bit like an IB scale, where 7 is you absolutely are full-on atheist. Yeah. You think there's definitely no God, and 1 is you are full-on believer. And I think he said he's a 6.8 or something like that. And I feel a bit like that I would never say I'm an atheist in the sense that so many people take that word to mean I know God doesn't exist. I absolutely don't say that. However, I completely live my life as though that is the case. And I don't, I could ask Guy this, I mean, do you pray? Do you worship? These things I don't do. And because I'm an atheist, I live my life without God. And my last point is this idea of being an anti-theist. That, for example, your first point about the creation of the universe, something out of nothing, very, very difficult for atheists to try and understand that. But let's try. Let's really think about it. What can we do with this? Whereas if God exists, you just say, oh, let's explain then. We can stop thinking about that. And I think it's just nicer if we say, why don't we give this difficult one a go? Where does morality come from? Well, let's try and work that out, rather than just saying, God does that. And so I think I'm an anti-theist in that I think it's a more fun place to be, a universe without a God.
Sure.
I'm still an agnostic. I've managed to hold on to that position. I'm just sort of like the other side of Richard's coin, I guess. And I don't see a way to resolve the metaphysical question, does the entity God exist? I don't see a way to resolve that question. If I'm borrowing James's looser language, I'm happy to say that God exists for me. And I think that's a reasonable thing to do. And I don't know whether there's an intellectual reason for this or I'm just wired differently from Richard. I hope that there's a God and I live my life as though there is one. And I do the things that he asks me whether I do. And I do pray and participate in worship. Those things work very well for me. I do take issue with some of what perhaps we'll talk about this in a bit is saying about is kind of perhaps believing God kills our curiosity about things. I don't think it has to. I think one could choose for it to do so, but I don't actually see an incompatibility between taking God to exist and being curious about the workings of the world. But perhaps that's one for us to come on to in a bit.
And I'm a Christian. I don't think Christianity is an idea or a religion or a philosophy. And it doesn't matter how many people share it as to its strength. I believe that there's a personal God out there who I can have a relationship with and know and be loved by. It doesn't matter whether it's fun, but I would say it's been an amazing experience. But the fun doesn't change the truth of the claim, although I wouldn't change it.
Got it. Now, Dr. Williams, you had a song request. Can you
Yes.
tell us about the song that you requested us to play?
I have requested the song Thoughts of a Dying Atheist by Muse. Most of the reasons for this are musical. I just love this tune. It's a great tune. But the title is somewhat evocative of what we're talking about today. And it's a really, really interesting song for a couple of reasons. One is it's a kind of jolly, cheerful tune, but the lyrics are really dark and worrying. And I love it when you get that kind of disconnect in a song, which I think is most interesting. And the other thing about this song is, as you listen to it, take in the lyrics, it is the words of somebody who's committed to atheism, but is living some very negative consequences for their atheism. And I think sometimes people muddle up the validity of beliefs with whether it's nice to hold the belief or not. And of
Be
course,
careful, Mr. Atherton.
it's perfectly possible to be an atheist and to have an unpleasant experience of being an atheist, but for atheism yet to be true, and that is what this song, I think, see what your listeners think, is about.
Sure. Now let's have a go and enjoy the dying wish of atheist. Welcome back, everybody. This is Jack Chong's Wednesday Life, and once again, we have a discussion on does God exist. Now, let's move on to the second session, which I think Mr. Atherton quite nicely put in the mini summary in the previous session about how today's discussion can be briefly dissected into two sections. The first part is it rational? Can we know that God exists? And the second part is, if God doesn't exist, should we behave as if he exists? Or how should we, or in general, how do we act morally? Now, Dr. Williams, you talked about that you are on the same side, different side, but the same coin of Mr. Atherton. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, we seem to both share a fairly strong belief that we're not going to be able to prove or disprove the proposition that God exists. So just as a question of knowledge, I guess we're fairly well aligned, I think, on that one. But Mr. Atherton, Richard, says that's what we agreed before. He says that he hopes that God doesn't exist and he lives his life as an atheist. So it's kind of functionally he's an atheist. I don't do that. And, I don't know whether I've really self-examined myself on this one. And do I actually have anxiety about whether this is the right decision or not? Or is it just a matter of habits or preference? I'm not sure. But I do actually live as a religious person. I believe it's reasonable to live as though there is a God.
What do you mean you live as a religious person? What kind of traits do you think you possess?
So I pray, I go into chapel, and I take part, sing loudly, love the Bible, read the Bible, and it's not just this is nice. It's like a really moving thing for me as well. I don't think it's enough to just say this is a fun aesthetic experience. I don't think that would be religion. I think that would be something else. And of course, at the back of my mind, as a true agnostic, is a possibility that all of this does correspond to an objective reality. So it's again, it's not just a game. Also, there's something really meaningful about participation in religion from my point of view.
Might you actually be just a Christian who has lots of doubts?
Yeah, I'm happy with that label too. I'm happy with that label. It depends how we're using these labels, theists and atheists. If we're just entering into purely intellectual discussion about can I know a proposition to be true or not, I would say I cannot know the proposition God exists to be true. So in that respect, I'm not a theist, but I think that's probably the only significant respect in which I'm not. And I very happily would refer to myself as a Christian, tick that box on the census or what have you, and participate in that form of life.
Simon, would you call yourself an agnostic, or do you actually know God exists?
I wouldn't call myself an agnostic. I think we all make decisions in life. We have to know enough to make decisions, and all of us, there isn't a neutral position on God. We all have to make a decision about how we're going to live life and what's true out there. And saying, I don't know enough and I don't think there's a God out there, but if he is out there, he won't mind me ignoring him, is a faith position in a sense. So we've all made a faith judgment on the best of our knowledge. I've outlined earlier why I think this is the most reasonable position, and it's persuaded me, and then I've found it to be true in my experience as well. So as far as one can know this sort of thing, I think I would know. I think I do know.
I think Dr. Williams ticks all the boxes for being a Christian, except one, which is you don't have 100% faith in the existence of God. You are like 50-50 or 70-30 on a sliding scale.
50. I have no idea whether it exists.
You have no idea.
So it's 50.
Okay.
It's got to be 50.
So it's a question mark.
Basis. I think the rational thing is to say 50-50.
Sure. What about you, Mr. Atherton? What particular aspects of your daily life behavior that makes you call yourself an atheist?
Well, this started for me when I was about 14, when I wrote to the Bishop of Liverpool, as you do when you are a pretentious 14-year-old. And he was a great man, the Bishop of Liverpool, and but it was very kind to respond. But I asked him the question, what would you do if your conscience and the Bible disagreed? And his response was, you should educate your conscience. Which I thought was a very interesting response. I didn't fully understand at the time, and I've thought about it a great deal. and I do now respect it. But it's sort of it sent me on the route towards atheism, that response, even though now I understand it better. But so I'm an atheist in the sense that for things like morality, I sit down and I try and work out what the best thing to do is. I don't refer to God in that thought process. I just simply sit down and say, what should I do now? And it's the same with all types of decision making and thinking. I just simply don't factor in whether there's a God or not. I just basically assume there isn't. And while accepting there might be, absolutely. And if I die and then I go up to heaven and God says, then
Welcome back.
then I'll say, oh, sorry, got that one wrong. I don't know whether he's going to torture me for eternity for that error or not. But I'm certainly just, that's how I will live my life.
But it's interesting, isn't it? Because would you say that in your daily life, for example, there's a third-person observer who knows nothing about your belief and Dr. Williams' belief. And if they observe how you interact with the family members, if they do a psychometric test on your personality traits, and to really know your moral standards, would you say that you guys will have the same results, regardless of what faith
I
you
think
have?
so, actually. I think you'd find it very difficult to split us. I think I'm very interested in how a Christian makes a moral decision. About animal rights, for example. How do you go about that? It seems to me that you're very likely to do an extremely similar thing to what I do.
Parenting style?
About
Parenting style. How to teach your kids on certain controversial moral issues. Well, that was probably not laid out explicitly on the Bible. Then how would you use your scale, use your ruler, religious ruler, to judge against the?
I think we'd be pretty similar. And where we differed, of course, it'd be so difficult to say whether it was matters of religion that made us differ, or we just happened to differ about things because we're different people. So I know how you could separate out the role of religion in causing us to be different on matters of morality and parenting. I'm not sure how we'd figure it out. I think an obvious, but I don't know whether this is an important difference. I think it is an important difference on matters of morality, etc. Is that I would still look to scripture, and I would still look to religious tradition and the voice of a community, and the kind of collective wisdom, I guess, of the centuries that have been passed on through a religious tradition. Because one of, I guess, part of my agnosto-religious perspective, you have to take religion really seriously as a cultural legacy.
Yep.
I think I'd have to do that. And actually, for me, one of the things I really profoundly believe in is that we learn from narratives and we learn from culture. And to me, one of the most powerful repositories of the wisdom of the ages is religion. That's a slightly separate matter to faith and belief in God, but I think it's one of the things religion passes on to us.
You ask a really interesting question about morality and whether you'd see the same lifestyle between all of us and whether we're similar. I'd want to start by saying I wouldn't try and claim that Christians were better in any sense. The Christian claim is actually that you turn to God because you know you are a bad person. So I certainly, as a Christian, wouldn't want to say that I was morally any better or worse, particularly, than these good fellows here. I think I would make moral decisions in a different way, and I would make different decisions, but I wouldn't claim either as a starting point or now that I was better. But I would use the Bible rather than my conscience, and I would be willing to say the Bible educates my conscience rather than the other way around.
And there's a very notable differences in how religion plays a role in your daily life. I think for Mr. Atherton's case, it seems to me that you're nominally saying that you act in an atheist manner, but if the way that you behave is the same as Dr. Williams, then you're practically a Christian. If you understand what I mean. It might be
a
hard for you
Muslim
to,
or a Jew or
a religious person.
I'm just a human being.
I think more likely Christian because of the way the social cultural background is shaped by Christian values.
Yes, or shaped by Roman values before Christianity.
Well, so is it? So, with that being said, is it even possible for anybody to act in an atheist manner, free from influences from any religion at all, as in behaving in a manner so distinctive from what major religions have taught their believers to do?
Well, we're not guinea pigs. We're able to think for ourselves. Yes, I've lived in a country that is I would still call just about a Christian country, but certainly has been a Christian country for 1,000 years. But that doesn't mean I'm not capable of independent thought, and I totally accept that the cultural heritage and all the sort of the morals that have come through the ages factor into my way of thinking, and some of those are from Christianity. I mean, I read a lot, as I'm sure Simon does, about pre-Christian civilizations. I just love Roman, Greek history, and we can learn a lot from them before Christianity came along. So,
but they are religious as well, and they were influenced
certainly
by
were.
their beliefs.
They certainly were. They believed in all kinds of gods. And I really like the Greek gods. I think they're much more fun and and much more, obviously human made. And they do help you understand tricky issues.
Sure. So let's have we're about to end our second session. Let's have a mini summary again about what role do you think religion plays in your own life. Can we start with Dr. Tapley?
Well, actually, I made very little contribution to that section. Were I to have done so, I probably would have commented on my role as chapel warden, which has the greatest impact in Christianity on my life on a daily basis. Perhaps we can talk about that in section 3. That's a role I take very seriously, by the way, and I'm very concerned that proper respect is shown to all corners who are affected by chapel, which are many corners in the school. So I take that role very seriously. But in terms of just your last question, I believe, like Mr. Atherton, you can answer a question intellectually without reference to God, a moral question, that is. But I also accept your point, Jack. What you're saying is we've been brought up in a Judeo-Christian Western world which has its own cultures, norms, and we have obviously been influenced by those cultures and norms. Can I extract myself from that conditioning process? However much I might try, I'm sure there'll be traces left.
Sure. Mr. Atherton?
Well, I think religion plays a wonderful role in our society and societies around the world. And I think atheism plays a part of that. I certainly don't think of atheism as a religion, but it's just, some people would say that. Dr. Selden's wife would always tell that to me. So it's just part of the rich fabric of our world. I just want everyone to make their own decisions. That's why I in many ways don't want there to be a God. I don't want there to be just an objective right and wrong that we're trying to search for. Let's try and make our own decisions. So you were kind of implying that I'm teaching my kids, this is right, this is wrong. I'm not doing that. I'm trying to give my kids tools so that they can make their own decisions. And because I don't think there is a God, and so we're going to have to sort it out for ourselves individually. And if some people want to form a religion, that's wonderful. And I think culturally it's been just a wonderful thing over the years.
Got it. Dr. Williams?
As I've said before, I think my engagement with religion is perhaps just something that I've habitually followed, and I'm not sure whether I have a very strong reason for it, but it is, I suppose, the main motivation for why I continue to live as though there's a God is the enormous joy and happiness that my engagement with faith brings to me, and as a kind of part of my life, or as a way of living my life, as participation in religion is something that I draw immense personal value from. So that's kind of the basis, I guess, on which I sell it to myself. It makes me very happy.
Sure. Mr. Allcock?
I don't know whether I'd want to even describe myself as religious. A religion carries with it a lot of tags of sort of dressing up and buildings and rituals and so on. And a lot of Christians would say they weren't religious, but I would say I have a personal faith, and that shapes everything I do. I believe that there's a God who I can know and talk to, and I do talk to him. I read the Bible and pray every day, and it shapes my decision making in life. It gives purpose, and all the studies show that having purpose actually gives meaning and happiness to life. So it has its positives, but that's not to do with whether it's true.
Understood. Now, Mr. Oko, you requested Amazing Grace. Can you talk to us a little bit more about that song?
Yeah, very briefly. Of all the hymns, it's one of the most famous and one of the most beautiful, but also as a summary of what a Christian believes. The Christian message is that there is amazing grace, that God gives us something we don't deserve in any way. It's written by John Newton, who was a slave trader and changed his life when he came to know God, gave up the slave trade and became a Christian preacher. And the words of the first verse, that this grace saved a wretch even like him, is a wonderful story.
Thank you. Enjoy Amazing Grace.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see. 'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fears relieved. How precious did that grace appear! The I first believed. Through many dangers, toils, and snares, we have already come. 'Twas grace that brought us safe thus far, and grace will bring us home. The Lord has brought His fruit to me. His word my hope
Thank you. Hope you enjoy the Amazing Grace of the Amazing Grace. Now we're back to our third section. We will be actively seeking to find common ground in our panelist, which interestingly you all sit in according to your spectrum of beliefs.
Holiness, yeah.
Now, Mr. Atherton, before during the break, we were just discussing about the role of religion plays in society from a historical perspective. Would you like to elaborate on that?
I think that Christianity gets often credited with too much. People say, Christianity created the morality that we all live by, and me as an atheist, I've just inherited that. But I just don't think that's true. I think Christianity came out of the Jewish sect living at Roman times, and they had very great moral code considering the times. I think the Romans have influenced us hugely, particularly with Roman law, for example, but things like work ethic. I think the Greek myths greatly influence us, and I just feel that Christianity, wonderful though it is just part of a rich fabric. And so this idea that it all comes down to Christianity, it just seems to be wrong to me.
Well, if let me put it this way, then I think in terms of the first question that we attempt to tackle within this 1 hour show, is it rational to believe in God? Can we know God exists? I think there's a common ground here, right? So 3 of you believe that it is impossible to know whether or not God exists. 1 of you think that it is possible and that he exists.
No, I agree with Simon that it is possible for a Christian to know that God exists.
Oh.
It's just not possible for me to know that God doesn't exist.
It is possible for a Christian to know that God exists, but then Christian, by definition, has to take the leap of faith that God exists. Then it seems to me it's like
I think it's perfectly rational for Simon to say that he knows that God exists. I think that's a perfectly sensible thing to say. I mean, I don't agree with it, but I think it's totally valid for him to say that. I don't think it's valid for me to say, I know there are no gods. I know that. That's just wrong, I think. But I just don't accept that that's wrong for Simon to say that.
Could you explain what it means to be valid for me to say it, but you don't agree?
Because you can get proper evidence of it. You have. I mean, I can't speak for you, but I know some Christians have felt the presence of God and seen God and had a two-way conversation with God. I know many Christians like that, and I think, well, that's evidence. That's strong evidence that God exists. So I'm totally happy to say that they know God exists. That's fine by me.
But then you won't
totally
accept,
irrational.
You won't be.
But I don't think they're right. Yeah. So I'm not persuaded by that as from my point of view. The evidence, there's some problems with that evidence from my point of view, but not from their point of view. Sorry.
Dr. Tapley?
What's the question? Sorry, Jack.
You're an let me phrase it this way. So you're an existentialist. And you know what? Let me rephrase the question so that it's more tailored towards your philosophical belief. So there is a Danish philosopher, Kierkegaard. Excuse my Danish pronunciation or my English pronunciation. He is a Christian. He's a Christian existentialist. And how would you say that the greater worldview of that debate of theism versus atheism or skepticism fit within the philosophical belief of existentialism?
How does doubt fit within existentialism? It fits very comfortably because I would, and I follow Sartre very closely on this. Tolerance is central to existentialism. Respect for the values of others is very central to existentialism. I don't see it, although Simon and I might have differences of opinion in response to the question, does God exist? We do not have any difference in terms of respect, mutual respect, for the fact we have different answers to that question. So there's no problem. The question of doubt for me is not one of conflict or one of argument. For me, much like Richard, I made decisions in my life which did not make reference to God, but I see no contradiction, no conflict with the values of the people who answer that question differently.
That's great. I'd like to see common ground in the second section, which is what role does religion play in your life? And if God doesn't exist, how would you behave? Would you behave as if he existed? But let me ask you a more question to the tangent. What do you see the future of religion in the next generation, or let's say in 10 years' time? Do you see any substantive change to religion? To organized religion, not personal beliefs?
Can I start us off on that one? I'm not going to make much comment on what I think the future of religion should be in terms of ecumenical matters, but I would like to make a comment that clearly it's never had more followers than it's had now. Religion is a central fact of life, and for me the most important, or one of the most important considerations going forward is this unity. So we saw the terrible attack 2 weeks ago in Christchurch, New Zealand, where tolerance was not exhibited. We had extremist behaviour. We have to find unity. We have to find tolerance. We have to find respect for other people's values, even if we do not hold those values ourselves. And whatever the future of religion might be in terms of matters that occupy those of faith, that's, for me, what has to be part of that future, is that unity, tolerance, respect for other people's values, and getting along.
That seems to me, I think the way you phrased it sounds religious. Sounds like it is a religious code of behavior or way of life, in the sense that Christianity, Islam, Buddhism advocate those values as well. But I think the interesting question is, going back to what I asked Mr. Atherton before, is it really possible to act in an atheist manner? Because what you just talked about, unity, tolerance, or even compassionate love for the disadvantaged, passionate for or call for justice, those are, would you all agree that those are universally human values, or would you take a step forward and say, no, those aren't universally human, they are specific in certain religions? What's your view on that?
I think a lot of moral values are universal, in the sense they're at least acknowledged by all cultures. However, I don't believe there is universal agreement across cultures on morality, because I do think different cultures have different values that they emphasize for certain reasons particular to their own historical situation. And you might have a Confucian interest in order and stability of government, which is quite particular as the kind of Chinese value. You might have a Western value, which is kind of Marxist radical egalitarian, or sort of Christian radical egalitarian view, which is particular in certain respects to a kind of Western perspective. I do think there is a universal core to values, but I still think there are cultural peculiarities. Perhaps with globalization we'll see these fade to some extent, and we're still in the very early stages of globalization. That might be one possible impact it has on religion and on our religious cultures.
Mr. Allcock, what's your view on the Christianity in 10 years' time?
I don't think God's going anywhere. The way you phrase your question is very interesting. Could there be a world without God, and is there a post-God world now, and so on? And I wonder whether that's the wrong question. One day, could there be a God post-world? That if there was a God before time who made the world, it's not God who's going to disappear. The world may disappear, and we may well be the ones who make a mess of it and destroy it, looking at how we're doing. God may be much more in existence and exist long after us. And worrying about what he thinks and how we relate to him, I think, is the important question for us.
Now, we're in the last 1 to 2 minutes of the show. Let's have a recap on the second session, because the first session, we all have reached a consensus on what you guys agree on, but whereas the second session is a bit unclear and ambiguous. So allow me just to summarize your positions. So Mr. Atherton and Dr. Williams, you're essentially twins, but with very different personalities.
Exactly.
Good
Yeah.
And as seen in your outfit today, of course. and then I would say, Dr. Tapley, your view on how we should act in life, in relation to the existence of God, is very closely linked with Dr. Williams, and I would say you guys would agree with each other very often as well. And then while Mr. Allcock, you'll tick all the boxes of being a good Christian. Would that be
Good
Not sure about
Christian,
good, but
yeah.
I'll take the other level.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for coming. We're all running out of time, so thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Cheers.
Thanks for having us on.
Cheers, Jack.
24 hours a day, online and on your mobile. The voice of the Wellington family. This is DukeBox.